You know that saying about keeping your friends close and your enemies closer? It's a nice little piece of advice, sure. Sounds great in movies. But out here in the real world, the problem is that sometimes you can't tell the difference between the two. I mean, sometimes the person smiling at you, pouring your tea, asking about your day, is the exact same person actively trying to ruin your life from the inside out. I'm in my mid-20s now. I live a pretty quiet life. But the story I'm about to tell you, it's a heavy one. It's about my parents, mostly. And it's about me, even though I was just a baby when it all went down. I need to get this out of my head because lately, the humid nights have been bringing the memories back, pressing down on my chest like a physical weight. Let me take you back to the early 2000s, Vietnam. To give you a clear picture, you need to understand who my dad was back then. My dad's folks were pretty well off. My grandfather owned a highly successful woodworking shop. It was the kind of place that smelled permanently of rich mahogany, sawdust, and harsh chemical varnish. My dad was their only son, the golden boy, and because he was the only son in an Asian family with money, he was spoiled rotten. Don't get me wrong, the old man wasn't a gangster or a criminal. He was just a playboy. He was incredibly good looking, he always had cash in his pocket, and he knew how to charm his way out of a burning building. My grandfather tried to teach him the trade from a young age, and my dad was actually a natural at it. He had the hands of an artist. But why spend your days sweating over a lathe in a dusty workshop when you could be out drinking, shooting pool, and chasing girls? So, he slacked off. He coasted on his looks and his family's money. He was reckless, sure, but mostly he was just a guy who thought the party would never end. My grandparents were desperate for him to settle down, but every girl he brought home was, well, a reflection of his lifestyle. Party girls. Flashy. Loud. Completely uninterested in building a family. My grandparents shot them all down, one by one. And then, my dad met my mom. It was a complete cliché, honestly. My dad was nursing a hangover one morning and stumbled into a local noodle stall for a bowl of pho. My mom was the daughter of the stall owner. She wasn't wearing heavy makeup or flashy clothes. She was just a hard-working girl, wiping down tables, her hair tied back, smelling faintly of star anise and simmering beef bone broth. My dad looked up from his bowl, saw her carrying a stack of steaming bowls, and boom, that was it. He was entirely, foolishly, hopelessly hooked. For a solid month, this guy, this notorious party animal, started eating at that noodle stall twice a day. He'd sit there, sweating in the suffocating midday heat, just to watch her work. He even started buying takeout to bring home to my grandparents. They thought he was losing his mind. But it worked. He wore her down with his sheer persistence, and eventually, she agreed to go out with him. When he finally brought her home, my grandparents were thrilled. She was polite, she knew how to cook, she knew the value of a hard day's work. She was exactly the grounding force my dad needed. But here's the thing about the past. It's sticky. You can't just outrun a reputation. My mom had a best friend back then. We'll call her Nina. Nina was dating this guy, Tommy. One night, the four of them went out for drinks. It was supposed to be a nice double date. But the second Tommy laid eyes on my dad, his face dropped. Tommy pulled Nina aside when my dad was at the bar and warned her that everyone knew my dad was a player who just used girls, drained them emotionally, and tossed them aside, basically telling her that my mom was walking straight into a trap. Nina, being the good friend she was, immediately pulled my mom into the bathroom and spilled everything. She laid it all out, every rumor, every ex-girlfriend, every late-night story she'd just heard. My mom was crushed. She was a practical woman. She hadn't let herself fall too deeply yet, so she made the logical choice. She decided to cut her losses. She met my dad the next day and told him it was over. She said she couldn't risk her heart on a guy who treated women like disposable cups. My dad panicked. He'd never been the one getting dumped. He pleaded with her. He swore he had changed, that she was different, that he only wanted her. But my mom wasn't buying it. Words are cheap, right? So, right there on the street, my dad did something drastic. In our culture, oaths are a big deal. You don't make promises to the universe unless you are prepared to pay the toll. My dad raised his hand, looked up at the sky, and swore a terrifying oath, begging the heavens and the earth to strike him down and snap his legs in half on the asphalt if he ever cheated on her or laid his hands on another woman. My mom was so horrified by the weight of that curse that she actually lunged forward and slapped her hand over his mouth. But it was too late. The words were out there in the ether, and it convinced her. She figured no one would invite that kind of bad juju onto themselves unless they meant it. They got married. For a year, things were genuinely perfect. The playboy was dead, he was a devoted husband, and then my mom got pregnant with me. Now, listen to me carefully. If you are listening to this, I need you to understand something before I go any further. I do not blame my mother for what happened next. Pregnancy is a brutal parasitic process for some women, and my mother drew the absolute shortest straw. The things that happened to her, they weren't her fault. The pregnancy ravaged her body. It was like I was draining every ounce of life and nutrients out of her. She was a petite woman, but her belly swelled to an unnatural size, stretching her skin until it was covered in deep, painful purple marks. But the worst part was her face. Her hormones went entirely haywire. Her face erupted in severe, painful cystic acne. We're talking deep, infected welts covering her cheeks and forehead. It looked like burns. And because she was carrying me, she couldn't take any strong medication. She just had to suffer through it. It was completely screwed up. Her self-esteem plummeted into an abyss. She couldn't even look in the mirror without crying. And that physical pain mutated into a deep, ugly psychological resentment. She pushed my dad away, completely. The apartment we lived in was small, and the summer heat was relentless. The ceiling fan would just push hot, sticky air around the room. Every time my dad tried to comfort her, tried to put an arm around her or cuddle her, she would violently shove him off. She was exhausted, in pain, and felt completely disgusting. She became irritable, snapping at him for breathing too loud. The house became a damn pressure cooker of unspoken tension. My dad, well, he tried. He really did. But he was weak. He was a guy who was used to an easy life, and suddenly his home felt like a hostile environment. He was deeply frustrated, constantly rejected, and suffocating in the tense silence. So, he slipped back into his old habits. Just for a night, he told himself, just to blow off some steam. He called up his old buddies. They went out drinking. They ended up at one of those shady, neon-lit karaoke joints, the kind of place where the air is thick with cigarette smoke and cheap, overpowering perfume, the kind of place where you can pay for company. He drank too much. The room spun. When he woke up the next morning, his head pounding, the smell of unfamiliar floral perfume clinging to his shirt, he realized there was a girl, asleep next to him. The guilt hit him like a physical punch to the gut. He had broken the oath. He felt like absolute crap. He went home, desperately wanting to confess, to beg for forgiveness. But he walked through the door, and my mom immediately yelled at him for tracking dirt on the floor. Her eyes dark with exhaustion. He choked. He swallowed the truth and buried it deep. But a secret like that is a rot. It hollows you out. And because he had already crossed the line, the boundary was gone. He started doing it again. Whenever the house got too tense, he'd make an excuse, go out, and numb himself with cheap liquor and cheaper company. No one knew, or so he thought. Months passed. I was born. You'd think a baby would fix things, right? Wrong. The sleepless nights, my constant screaming, the endless cycle of feeding and crying, it pushed my mom from severely stressed to completely burnt out. She was running on fumes, a ghost wandering the apartment with dark, sunken eyes. And that's when Nina, the best friend, reappeared in the picture. Nina was walking down a busy street one afternoon when she spotted my dad's motorcycle, and sitting behind him, her arms wrapped tight around his waist, was a girl, not my mom. Nina, being the absolute saint she was, didn't confront him. Oh no. She hid behind a vendor's cart, and watched them pull into the underground parking of a cheap motel. She stood there, baking in the afternoon sun for 2 solid hours, waiting until they walked back out. Gotcha. Nina went straight to my mom's house. She sat down at the kitchen table, probably drinking the tea my mom poured for her, and she dropped the bomb. She described the girl, the motel, the timeline, everything. My mom completely lost it. The betrayal wasn't just a wound. It was an explosion that leveled her entire reality. When my dad got home from work, the house was a war zone. She screamed until her voice went hoarse. She threw things. She called him every name in the book. She demanded to know how he could do this to her while she was destroying her body to give him a child. My grandparents rushed over, but here's the kicker. They took my dad's side. They thought my mom was just having a postpartum breakdown. They couldn't believe their golden boy, who was working so hard to provide, would do something so vile. My dad, terrified of losing everything, lied through his teeth. He denied it all. He gaslit her, telling her she was crazy, that her friend was just stirring up drama. It was a total bullshit move on his part. My mom stopped crying. She looked at him, her eyes suddenly entirely dead. Her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. She asked him if he remembered his oath to the heavens, coldly stating that if he was lying to her right then, she prayed the universe would actually snap his legs. The next afternoon, my dad was riding his motorcycle home from the workshop. A truck ran a red light. It clipped the back of his bike. He was thrown into the air and landed hard on the concrete curb. A clean, brutal compound fracture of his right femur. His leg was shattered. When the hospital called, my mom didn't flinch. She just packed a single bag. She walked into the living room, looked at me lying in my crib, and did the unthinkable. She turned her back on me. She went back to her own parents' house. When my maternal grandparents asked where the baby was, she looked right through them and coldly told them she didn't care if I starved or died, blaming me for making her look like a monster, and blaming my existence for ruining her life. The sheer venom in her voice terrified my grandparents. They knew something was deeply, fundamentally broken in her mind. They dragged her to a psychiatrist. The diagnosis was severe postpartum psychosis. It made sense. The trauma, the hormones, the betrayal. It had fractured her brain. For a whole month, my dad's parents took care of me while my mom was heavily medicated at her parents' house. My dad, stuck in a heavy plaster cast, would drag himself on crutches across town every single day. He'd sit at the foot of her bed, crying, apologizing, admitting to everything. Slowly, the medication seemed to work. The fog lifted. Her skin cleared up a bit. She started crying, realizing what she had said about me. She forgave my dad, blaming herself for pushing him away. She came back home. We were a family again. Should have ended there. That should be the end of the story, but it wasn't. About a week after she moved back in, Nina came to visit. She brought a basket of expensive fruits, apologizing for causing trouble. She sat in our living room, peeled a perfectly crisp apple, and handed a slice to my mom. My mom ate it. That night, the atmosphere in the apartment shifted. The air felt heavy, like the moment right before a massive thunderstorm hits. My dad was asleep on his side of the bed. I was in a bassinet a few feet away. My mom was having a nightmare. In the dream, she was standing on a busy street corner. She saw my dad walking away from her, holding hands with a strange woman. But the woman wasn't just holding his hand. She was holding a baby. Me. My mom tried to scream, tried to run after them, but her feet were glued to the pavement. The woman turned her head, looked back at my mom, and smiled. It was a wide, unnatural, ear-to-ear grin. My mom woke up with a gasp. She was drenched in cold sweat. The room was pitch black. She slowly turned her head. She heard a soft cooing sound coming from my bassinet. And then, a switch flipped in the dark. My dad woke up a few minutes later because it was too quiet. You know that parental instinct? The one that tells you when the silence is wrong? He sat up. He looked toward the bassinet. In the dim light filtering through the window blinds, he saw a silhouette standing over me. It was my mom. But she wasn't soothing me. She was leaning over, her arms completely rigid, her elbows locked. Both of her hands were pressed firmly over my tiny face, pinching my nose shut and clamping down on my mouth. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't crying. She was just standing there, applying steady, lethal pressure. My dad froze. For one agonizing second, sleep paralysis kept him pinned to the mattress. His brain couldn't process the visual. It looked like my mom, but her posture was completely wrong. It looked like a mannequin mimicking a human. It scared the absolute crap out of him. He barely managed to whisper her name into the dark, but she didn't turn around. She just kept pressing down. The spell broke. My dad threw the blankets off, ignoring the searing pain in his healing leg, and lunged across the room. He slammed his shoulder into her ribs. She flew backward, hitting the drywall with a sickening thud. I instantly gasped for air and started shrieking. My dad scooped me up, his heart hammering a hole through his ribs. "What the actual fuck are you doing?" he screamed, backing away from her. "Are you trying to kill him?" My mom was slumped against the wall in the shadows. Slowly, she raised her head. She didn't look angry. She looked bewildered. Her voice was flat and raspy as she just kept murmuring that it was all his fault. My grandparents came rushing down the hall. They found my dad clutching me like a shield, and my mom sitting on the floor, staring at her own hands as if she didn't recognize them. The doctor said she had relapsed. The stress of being back in the apartment triggered the psychosis again. They told her to stop nursing me, to let my grandmother take over all childcare duties. I was moved to my grandparents' room. My mom was essentially put on suicide watch in her own home, but the logic was starting to fray. A few nights later, my grandmother was a light sleeper. Around 3 a.m., she woke up to a sound. She woke up to this awful, rhythmic dragging sound, just a slow, deliberate scuffing of bare feet against the ceramic floor tiles that echoed down the dark hallway. My grandmother slowly sat up. The door to her bedroom was wide open. The hallway was dark, but the front door was ajar, letting in a sliver of pale moonlight from the balcony. And there, walking toward the balcony railing, was my mom. She was holding me. I don't know how she got me out of the crib without waking my grandmother, but she had me. She was walking toward the edge. We lived on the second floor over a concrete courtyard. A drop from there wouldn't just hurt a baby, it would shatter it. My grandmother tried to scream, but her throat seized up. It was pure, primal terror, the kind that turns your blood to ice water. She scrambled out of bed, her knees hitting the floor, and she crawled, then ran. My mom reached the railing. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look down. She just extended her arms out over the empty space, holding me over the void. Right as she opened her fingers to let me drop, my grandmother slammed into her from behind. She grabbed my mom's hair and yanked backward with everything she had. They all went tumbling backward onto the balcony floor. I hit the tiles and started wailing. The commotion woke the whole house. My dad and grandfather rushed out, dragging my mom inside. She fought them like a feral animal. She didn't speak. She just hissed and clawed, her eyes completely devoid of anything human. They sent her back to her parents' house. That very night, they realized she was a legitimate danger to my life. But whatever was inside her, it was getting stronger. Over the next 2 weeks, my mom deteriorated in a way that medical science couldn't explain. She stopped eating entirely. Her body shrank, her collarbones protruding like sharp rocks under her skin. Her hair started falling out in clumps. The dark circles under her eyes sank so deep she looked like a walking corpse. And the behavior, God, it's hard to even talk about. My grandmother would go into her room and find her sitting in the corner, chewing on raw, unwashed root vegetables she'd somehow smuggled from the kitchen, dirt staining her teeth. And then, it got darker. She stopped using the bathroom. She would soil herself in the corner of the bedroom. And worse, she would take the waste and smear it on her own arms, on her face, muttering incomprehensible syllables under her breath. The room smelled of ammonia, copper, and something sickeningly sweet, like rotting meat. The doctors were useless. They just wanted to institutionalize her. 5 different local shamans were brought to the house. They set up heavy offering tables, burned thick bundles of incense that choked the room, and forced her to drink murky water mixed with the ashes of burned paper talismans. Nothing worked. The moment they left, she would just go back to sitting in the dark, smearing filth on the walls. My maternal grandmother was a devout woman. She was watching her daughter decay before her eyes. One night, absolutely broken, she knelt before her small Buddhist altar in the living room. She pressed her forehead to the floor and wept. She made a vow. "If you save my daughter, I will shave my head and eat a vegetarian diet for the rest of my life. Just spare her." She cried herself to sleep on the floor. That night, my grandmother had a dream. The air in the dream was impossibly cold. She heard a sound, the bright, innocent laughter of a little boy. She opened her eyes and saw a child, maybe 3 years old, glowing with a soft white light. The boy reached out, took her wrinkled hand, and pulled her up. He didn't speak. He just led her out of the house, down streets she had never seen, until they stood before a massive iron gate. Beyond the gate was a temple, a very specific old temple. The boy pointed toward the center of the courtyard, where a towering white statue of the goddess of mercy, Kwanam, stood bathed in moonlight. The boy ran toward the statue and dissolved into the light. My grandmother woke up gasping. The name of the temple was burned into her retinas. She shook my grandfather awake. They made calls at dawn. By 8 a.m., they found out the temple actually existed, hidden away in a neighboring province. They didn't hesitate. They hired a van. Getting my mom into the van took 3 grown men. She thrashed, bit, and screamed with a strength that her emaciated body shouldn't have possessed. When they finally dragged her through the iron gates of that temple, the air shifted. The moment her feet touched the stone courtyard, my mom stopped fighting. She collapsed. She shrank in on herself, curling into a tight fetal position, trembling violently. It was like watching a cockroach scurry away from a flashlight. The head monk, an ancient man in simple brown robes, walked out of the main hall. He didn't ask what was wrong. He took one look at my mom huddled on the ground and sighed. He quietly told my family that she had been poisoned by a shadow, explaining that someone very close to her had planted a seed of malice inside her that was actively feeding on her grief. He didn't offer a name. He said revealing the culprit would only breed more hatred, and karma would handle the debt in its own time. They carried my mom into the main hall. It was heavy with the scent of burning sandalwood and melting wax. They sat her on a woven mat in the center of the room. The monk didn't yell. He didn't perform a theatrical exorcism. He simply took a wooden bowl of water that had been sitting on the altar, dipped a branch of leaves into it, and flicked the water onto her head. The second the droplets hit her skin, my mom arched her back and let out a sound I pray I never hear a recording of. It wasn't human. It was the sound of an animal caught in a steel trap. 5 monks sat in a circle around her and began to chant. The low, guttural vibration of their voices filled the room, pressing against the eardrums. It was a solid wall of sound. My mom writhed on the floor. She clutched her head, tearing at her hair, screaming for them to stop. The chanting went on for 2 straight hours. The air in the room grew freezing cold, then suffocatingly hot. My mom was drenched in sweat, gasping for air, her fingernails scraping bloody grooves into the wooden floorboards. Finally, she collapsed, entirely limp. The monks told my family to take her home, but to bring her back every single day. They did. For 14 days, they dragged her back, and every day, it was a war of attrition. But on the second day, things took a terrifying turn. During the chanting, the head monk forced her to drink a cup of the altar water. As the water hit her stomach, my mom started gagging. She leaned over a bucket and vomited, but it wasn't food. It was a thick, viscous, blackish-green sludge. It smelled like stagnant swamp water and rotting flesh. It was physically impossible for a human stomach to produce that much fluid, let alone something that looked like industrial waste. Every day, she threw up more of the black sludge, and every day, the fog in her eyes cleared just a fraction of an inch. She started recognizing her parents. She stopped smearing filth. On the 14th day, the final day, the chanting reached a fever pitch. My mom lurched forward, choking violently. She gripped the edges of the bucket, her knuckles white and wretched. With a sickening, wet slop, something solid hit the bottom of the plastic bucket. The chanting stopped instantly. My grandfather looked into the bucket. Sitting in a pool of dark liquid was a solid, gelatinous lump of coagulated blood. It was the size of a fist. It looked exactly like a slaughterhouse blood clot. The head monk nodded slowly, confirming to everyone that the root was finally gone and the entity was out. He took a bundle of fresh flowers, soaked them in holy water, and washed my mother's face and hands. When my mom opened her eyes, the dark sunken hollows were still there, but the light was back. She looked around the temple, confused, terrified, and burst into real human tears. She remembered bits and pieces. She remembered the suffocating darkness, the feeling of being a passenger in her own body while someone else drove. When she finally came home and held me, she didn't let go for hours, just weeping into my blanket. It took months for her body to recover, but the spiritual rot was gone. When the dust settled, my mom sat down and forced herself to trace the timeline back. When did the madness truly take hold? It wasn't the broken leg. It wasn't the stress. It was the night of the nightmare. The night she tried to smother me. And what happened the afternoon before that night? Nina. The visit. The apology. The piece of sliced apple handed directly to her. My mom tried to call her. The number was disconnected. She went to Nina's house. It was empty. The landlord said she had packed up in the middle of the night and bolted. We never got hard proof. You can't take a blood clot to the police and arrest someone for witchcraft. But the timing was absolute. Nina had found someone who dabbled in the dark arts, bought a hex, and fed it to my mother hidden in a piece of fruit. The hex was designed to destroy the thing my mother loved most, making her the instrument of her own ruin. Years later, we heard a rumor from an old neighbor. They said Nina had gotten pregnant by a married man. The guy abandoned her, completely denied the child, and left her to face the shame alone. Her family couldn't handle the scandal, sold their house at a loss, and moved away to the countryside, disappearing into obscurity. Karma, I guess. The universe always balances its books. I'm grown now. I have a good relationship with my parents. I never hold what happened against my mom. How could I? She was a victim of something so insidious, so cruel, that it defies logic. But I'll be honest with you. Hearing this story from them as an adult, it messes with your head, knowing that someone hated my family so much that they used black magic to turn my own mother into a weapon against me. Whenever I visit my parents now and step out onto that second-floor balcony, I look down at the concrete courtyard below, and a cold shiver runs down my spine. I was just a baby, completely helpless, held over the edge of the void by the person who gave me life. It taught me a very ugly truth early on. The scariest monsters aren't the ghosts hiding in the dark. They're the best friends, sitting across from you in your living room, smiling, waiting for their chance to push you over the edge. You know, there's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes with trying to organize a massive family vacation. It's not just the packing or the flights, it's the mental gymnastics of trying to keep 3 different generations happy at the exact same time. Last summer, we decided to do just that. We packed up the entire bloodline. My parents, my husband and me, my younger sister Faye and her husband, and a whole squad of kids. My brother couldn't make it, so he just shipped his 2 kids along with us. Add it all up, and you've got 12 people, ranging from 60-somethings down to a 3rd grader, all ready for a 4-day, 3-night getaway. We picked Phu Quoc, a tropical island down in the south. It's a stunning place, usually packed with tourists, famous for its fish sauce, its pearls, and these miles of blindingly white beaches. But there's also a heavy, unspoken history to the island, something you kind of feel in the humidity when you step off the plane. With 12 people, booking hotel rooms was a logistical nightmare. We didn't want to be scattered across different floors, constantly texting each other to coordinate breakfast. So, we did what seemed like the smartest thing at the time. We rented a massive, standalone luxury villa inside a high-end resort complex. When we pulled up in our rented vans, I have to admit, the place looked incredible. It was this sleek, modern compound. Every single villa in this sector was built identically, cookie-cutter perfection. Floor-to-ceiling glass, minimalist furniture, private swimming pools out front, and these lush, perfectly manicured coconut palms framing the driveways. It felt like something out of a lifestyle magazine, but almost immediately, something felt off. It was the peak of summer, high tourist season. The island should have been bursting at the seams with families and backpackers. Yet, as we drove through the resort, it was a ghost town. I mean, it was dead silent. I looked at the identical villas surrounding ours, and the curtains were all drawn. No wet towels hanging over the balconies, no pool floats, no sound of music. Just empty, air-conditioned husks. A few blocks down, I could maybe spot one or two places that looked occupied, but our immediate vicinity was completely barren. Honestly, I brushed it off. I was just glad we didn't have to deal with noisy neighbors. We had the whole place to ourselves. We could walk straight down to a private stretch of beach, or just lounge by our own pool. The first day was chaotic in a good way. We took the rental cars out, hit up the seafood markets, took a million photos, and completely exhausted ourselves. By the time we got back to the villa to formally settle in, it was dark. The layout of the house was spacious. There was a massive master bedroom on the ground floor, 2 standard guest rooms upstairs, and a weird little windowless room that looked like it was supposed to be a storage closet but had a bed shoved into it. We all took one look at that tiny room and collectively decided nobody was sleeping in there. Faye and her husband took one upstairs room. My husband and I took the other. My parents claimed the giant master suite downstairs, and since the room was basically the size of a bowling alley, all 6 kids dragged their blankets and pillows in there, camping out on the floor and the couches to give us adults some privacy. That night, after a heavy BQ dinner and way too many beers by the pool, we all crashed around 11. Now, you have to understand something about me. I am a notoriously terrible sleeper. Put me in a strange bed, with different pillows and unfamiliar air conditioning noises, and I will stare at the ceiling until sunrise. I usually need a fan blowing directly on my face in complete silence. But that night, the second the back of my head touched that ridiculously soft hotel pillow, I was gone. It wasn't just falling asleep. It was like sinking to the bottom of a dark, heavy ocean. It felt chemical. I was completely paralyzed in this thick, dreamless void. At some point in the middle of the night, I vaguely, fuzzily registered my husband nudging me. You know, trying to initiate some vacation intimacy. I was so unbelievably heavy, so anchored to the mattress, that I couldn't even form the words to tell him to stop. I just let out a muffled groan and slipped right back under. I figured if he wanted to do his thing, whatever, I was too dead to the world to care. The next morning, the island sun was blinding. My husband and Faye's husband had woken up early and taken the scooters out to find some local coffee. The older kids were still dead to the world, and the little ones were already splashing in the pool. It was just my mom, Faye, and me sitting at the kitchen island, picking at some breakfast pastries. My mom took a sip of her tea, put the cup down with a sharp clink, and gave Faye and me this deeply disapproving glare, lowering her voice to a harsh whisper to scold us about lacking basic decency on a family trip with our parents and a house full of kids right downstairs. Faye and I just stared at each other, total blank slates, and Faye mumbled through a mouthful of croissant, genuinely asking what on earth Mom was talking about. My mom leaned in, looking genuinely annoyed as she accused one of us of keeping her and my dad awake all night, describing this heavy, rhythmic thumping of a bed frame repeatedly slamming into the upstairs wall, a relentless, agonizing screech of wood and metal that echoed through the whole damn ceiling for hours, until the kids started giggling and my parents didn't know where to look. Faye immediately threw her hands up, her face turning bright red as she fiercely defended herself, swearing that they were dead on their feet and had passed out fully clothed the second they hit the mattress. My mom slowly turned her gaze to me, and my stomach did this weird, uncomfortable flip, because I couldn't confidently say no. I vaguely remembered my husband nudging me, I remembered the heavy, drugged feeling. I had been pretty buzzed from the beers. Maybe we did? Maybe he did and I just slept through the entire thing? The thought was embarrassing, but I wasn't going to admit that to my mother. I quickly waved my hand, deflecting her accusation by telling her she was being completely ridiculous and suggesting it was probably just a rattling AC unit in an unfamiliar house. She just scoffed at my excuse, bitterly adding that she'd had to lie to the kids, telling them it was the sound of a ghost moving furniture, just to terrify them into staying quiet and going back to sleep. Right at that word, ghost, Faye stopped chewing, putting her pastry down and wiping her hands on a napkin as she nervously looked around the kitchen, lowering her voice to tell us that since Mom brought it up, her husband had confessed something really messed up to her that morning. I rolled my eyes, knowing Faye's husband was a bit of a dramatic guy, and sarcastically asked if the Wi-Fi had gone out. Faye insisted I listen, leaning over the counter to explain that around 3 or 4 in the morning, her husband had been dead asleep when he suddenly felt a stinging pain on his cheek, waking up furious because he thought someone had violently slapped him awake. She took a breath. He opened his eyes, ready to yell at me, she said, but he saw me, lying perfectly still, facing the other way, fast asleep. So he thought, okay, weird muscle spasm, maybe a weird dream. She said he closed his eyes again, only to be jolted awake not even 10 minutes later by the jarring, meaty sound of 3 sharp, brutal slaps across his face, followed immediately by the suffocating feeling of an old, raspy woman's voice whispering right into his ear, desperately begging him to wake up and get out of bed right then. My mom stopped drinking her tea. I just stared at Faye, waiting for the punchline. Faye's voice trembled as she described how he opened his eyes to find an incredibly old woman standing right next to his side of the bed, wearing traditional faded silk pajamas and a checkered bandana, and before he could react, she grabbed his wrist with fingers that felt like cold iron. Faye described how the old woman had yanked him toward the door, looking back frantically to scream at him to run for his life because they were coming to kill him. I let out a nervous little laugh, hollow in the empty kitchen, trying to brush it off as a nightmare caused by eating too much squid the night before. Faye snapped at me to let her finish, her voice trembling as she explained that he was so terrified by the urgency that he actually ran toward the door, only to stop and look back at the bed to see his own body still lying there, eyes closed. A heavy, suffocating silence dropped over the kitchen. The hum of the refrigerator suddenly seemed incredibly loud. She whispered that he was completely outside of his body, asking the old woman what was going on and instinctively calling her Grandma despite never having seen her before. According to Faye, the old woman pleaded with him to leave his body behind or else he'd be taken, but the second her husband refused to leave without her, the woman snapped, and her voice mutated into a booming, deafening roar, echoing violently inside his skull, furiously cursing him for being a piece of garbage who wouldn't listen. He grabbed his head in pain. When he opened his eyes and looked at her again, she was gone. Standing in her place was something else. He couldn't even describe it properly. He said it was massive, towering over him, covered in coarse black hair. It had a face like a rotting cow, but it was spreading these huge leathery arms like bat wings. It was so big it practically filled the hallway, reaching out to smother him. My mom let out a shaky breath, crossing her arms over her chest. He panicked, Faye said, speaking faster now. He turned around to run back to his body, to try and dive back into himself. But as he looked at the bed, there was a man standing over me. A tall, heavily built Western man, no shirt, chest covered in thick hair, and he was holding an old-school heavy 6-shooter revolver, pointing it directly at my forehead. She said her husband lunged across the room to tackle the soldier, but the massive man simply locked eyes with him, aimed the revolver right between his eyes, and pulled the trigger with a deafening metallic crack that snapped him violently awake, gasping for air at 4:45 a.m. He went to the bathroom, splashed water on his face, and just sat in a chair until your husband woke up to go get coffee. When Faye finished, the kitchen was dead quiet. I could feel the cold air from the AC unit biting into my skin. My mom just rubbed her arms, shivering in the cold AC, and muttered under her breath about what a horrible thing that was to dream about. And right then, that's exactly what we did. We rationalized it. Human brains are remarkably efficient at protecting themselves from things that break the rules of reality. We sat there in the bright, cheerful morning light, listening to the kids splashing in the pool, and we built a fortress of logic. It was a nightmare. Sleep paralysis, a hyper-realistic hallucination brought on by travel fatigue, alcohol, and an unfamiliar environment. When the guys got back with the coffee, my brother-in-law even told the story himself, laughing about how messed up his brain was, comparing it to an action movie. We felt safe, because monsters don't survive in the daylight. Fast forward to about 1 o'clock that afternoon. The island heat was absolutely punishing. Most of the family had taken the cars to go explore a pearl farm on the other side of the island. It was just my husband, me, and the 3 youngest kids left at the villa. We were exhausted, so we told the kids to play in the pool out front while we took a nap in the living room right behind the glass doors. The pool was tiny, not deep at all, and the kids were old enough to not drown, so we weren't overly worried. We had been dozing on the couch for maybe 30 minutes when a sudden, chaotic shrieking erupted from the patio. We were jolted awake by a sudden, chaotic shrieking erupting from the patio, the kids frantically screaming our names in pure, unadulterated panic. It wasn't playful screaming. My husband and I jolted awake, thinking someone had slipped and cracked their head open. We scrambled off the couch, threw open the sliding glass doors, and ran out to the pool. The 3 kids were huddled together, sitting on the edge of the water, shivering despite the 90-degree heat. Their faces were completely drained of color. I demanded to know what had happened, and if everyone was okay, my eyes frantically scanning the shallow water. The 2 older ones just shook their heads violently, pointing shaking fingers at the youngest. Little Cherry, Faye's youngest daughter. She's in the 3rd grade, a sweet kid, not prone to making up stories. Cherry looked up at me, her teeth literally chattering, and pointed a tiny shaking finger right past me into the living room, stammering out that a man had been walking back and forth right behind us. My husband frowned, his voice tight as he gently asked her what man she was talking about, and if someone had come to the door. Cherry shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes, crying that the man was inside, staring out at them through the glass, wearing nothing but green underwear and holding a gun. The blood in my veins turned to ice water. The world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. She sobbed that she thought he was a robber and was about to scream for us, but the man suddenly stopped, glared at her with huge, angry eyes, and terrified her so badly she ducked under the water, only to find him gone when she came back up. I physically stumbled back. I felt my husband grab my arm to steady me, but I wasn't looking at him. I was staring into the empty, sunlit living room. My niece had just perfectly described the exact same phantom soldier that my brother-in-law had seen in his nightmare 12 hours earlier, and there was absolutely no way she could have known. We hadn't discussed the dream around the kids. My husband hadn't even heard the story yet. My husband crouched down, desperately trying to keep the panic out of his voice as he fed her a flimsy, pathetic excuse about how a drunk tourist must have wandered into the wrong identical villa by mistake and left when he realized his error. It was the most pathetic, flimsy excuse I had ever heard. A lost tourist, walking around our locked living room with a firearm in his underwear, and then vanishing into thin air. I pulled out my phone with trembling hands and frantically texted Faye, telling her that Cherry had just seen the exact same man from her husband's dream pacing in our living room, wide awake. The typing bubble appeared instantly, with Faye demanding to know what the hell I was talking about, and after I swore I wasn't joking and begged to know what we should do, she just replied that they were heading back immediately. When the rest of the family returned, the atmosphere in the villa had shifted from a vacation home to a quarantine zone. The air felt thick, oppressive, like the pressure right before a massive thunderstorm. My dad, ever the stubborn patriarch, immediately shut down any talk of leaving. He had paid good money for this rental, and he wasn't going to let silly ghost stories ruin the trip. He demanded we stop talking about it so we wouldn't scare the kids further, but nobody relaxed. The afternoon dragged into an agonizing evening. We tried to maintain a facade of normalcy. We ordered food in. The men started drinking heavily on the patio, trying to laugh loudly and pretend everything was fine. But by 10 p.m., an unspoken agreement seemed to settle over the rest of us, and of the women or children were going to sleep in their separate rooms. Slowly, quietly, all the kids, my mom, my sister and I, migrated into the massive master bedroom on the ground floor. We dragged mattresses off the upstairs beds, piling them onto the floor. We turned on the huge flat-screen TV, jacking the volume up, trying to drown out the oppressive silence of the house. We were waiting for the men to finish drinking so we could lock the door and hunker down. I was sitting on the edge of the main bed, my back against the headboard. The wall of the bedroom facing the hallway and the patio was entirely made of glass. I picked up my phone. The screen illuminated my face. It was exactly 11 p.m. I let out a tired sigh, locked the screen, and lowered the phone. And there they were, standing right outside the glass door, in the dimly lit hallway, staring directly into the room. Not one, 3 of them. My breath caught in my throat like a jagged piece of glass. My heart didn't just beat, it hammered violently against my ribs, demanding to escape. In the center was the man Cherry and my brother-in-law had seen. Massive, hairy chest, khaki military-issue underwear, a heavy revolver dangling loosely from his right hand. His eyes were wide, unblinking, locked onto us, with a look of pure predatory hatred. To his left was a thinner man, but he was destroyed. The entire left side of his torso and his left arm were just gone. It wasn't clean. It was a ruin of jagged ribs and wet, glistening muscle. Thick, black blood, not red but oily, tar-like black, was slowly dripping onto the pristine tiled floor, chunks of rotting meat hanging loose like overcooked stew. Behind them stood a third figure, older, face-shadowed, his expression hollow and vacant. But the detail that completely shattered my sanity was their lower halves. They had no legs. Below the knees, there was nothing but empty air. The 3 of them were just hovering there, swaying slightly, staring into our brightly lit room. A primal, animalistic panic completely hijacked my nervous system. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My vocal cords were paralyzed. My hand convulsed, and I violently hurled my phone across the room. It smashed against the glass door with a sharp crack and hit the floor. The loud noise made everyone jump, and Faye scrambled backward, frantically shouting my name and demanding to know what was wrong with me. Out on the patio, the men stopped talking. My husband yanked the bedroom door open, reeking of beer, loudly asking what had happened and who had broken something. I was hyperventilating, burying my face in my knees and rocking back and forth as I pointed a shaking, rigid finger at the glass, desperately sobbing for them to look at the men standing out there. My husband looked. Faye looked. My mom looked. My husband stared into the empty hallway, his voice laced with a mixture of confusion and profound annoyance as he told me there was absolutely nobody out there. I felt my grip on reality slipping. I looked up. The hallway was empty. Nothing. No blood on the tiles. No soldiers. Tears streamed down my face, and in a moment of pure, blinding hysteria, I screamed at the top of my lungs, "I swear to God, there were 3 Western men standing right there looking at us, and if I am fucking lying, let the lights go out right now." I shouldn't have said that. The absolute second the words left my mouth, the entire villa plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The AC stopped humming. The TV died. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Nobody breathed. Then, in the heavy, suffocating darkness, little Cherry's trembling voice piped up, pointing toward the hallway as she whispered that the man had just run past the window again. Total pandemonium. My mom shrieked like a woman trapped in a cage with a predator, scrambling in the dark for a flashlight while screaming at everyone to pack everything immediately, hysterically swearing that she didn't care what time it was or how much money we had spent. We were getting out of that house right that second. Even my stubborn dad didn't say a word this time. The absolute terror in the room was contagious. When the emergency backup lights finally flickered on a minute later, casting this sickly yellow glow over the villa, it looked like a war zone evacuation. We threw clothes into suitcases unzipped, dragged terrified, crying children by their arms, and sprinted for the rental vans. My brother-in-law sat in the driver's seat, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get the keys in the ignition, while my husband frantically booked 3 rooms at a cheap, brightly lit hotel right in the middle of the crowded town center. We drove away at midnight, nobody looking back at the identical, silent villas. We spent the last 2 days of the trip crammed into that cheap hotel. It was noisy, the beds were hard, and the view was of a brick wall. It was the safest I had ever felt. Nothing else happened. Whatever was in that resort, it didn't follow us. But the thing about surviving an encounter like that is that the horror doesn't end when you drive away. The true terror is what you take back home with you. The questions you can't unask. A few weeks after we got back to the city, the shock had somewhat worn off, leaving behind this raw, lingering paranoia. My husband and I were lying in our own bed, the streetlights filtering through the blinds. I turned to him, my chest impossibly tight, and whispered about that first night in the villa when Mom had complained about the bed squeaking. He just sighed, rubbing his eyes as he admitted how embarrassed he had been. Desperate for closure, I pleaded with him to confirm that he had initiated it, that he was the one who had bumped into me in the dark, but I couldn't even finish the sentence. He stopped rubbing his eyes, turned to look at me in the dim light, and in a dead flat voice, asked what on earth I was talking about. He told me he had been completely exhausted from driving around all day and drinking 6 beers, swearing up and down that he had hit the pillow, passed out, and hadn't touched me once that entire night. The air in our bedroom suddenly felt very, very cold. If my husband was dead asleep, and I was paralyzed, trapped in that unnatural, heavy slumber, then who, or what, was rhythmically shaking our bed violently enough to echo through the ceiling for hours? And what would have happened if I had opened my eyes? I don't know if you've ever inherited a secret, not a fun family recipe or a hidden bank account, but something heavy, something that just sits in the corner of your life, quietly breathing, waiting for you to acknowledge it. I'm in my late 20s now, and whenever my friends talk about their childhood homes, they get this warm, nostalgic look in their eyes. They talk about tire swings, or the smell of their mom's cooking, or the way the sunlight hit the living room floor. When I think about the house I grew up in, my chest just gets tight. My mouth goes dry. Look, my grandparents still live in this house. It's right in the middle of District 3, right in the heart of Saigon. If you've never been, it's a densely packed concrete grid where the exhaust fumes never really settle, and the roar of motorbikes is basically the heartbeat of the city. To own a massive multi-story house right on a main street there, it's a big deal. Today, that property is worth tens of billions of dong, easily a few $1,000,000. It's an absolute fortune. But if they offered to put my name on the deed tomorrow, I wouldn't take it. I wouldn't spend another night in that place if you paid me. To understand why, you have to go all the way back to late 1974. My grandparents bought the house in a massive rush. Things were incredibly tense back then. The war was coming to an end, the political climate was shifting by the hour, and my grandparents, who had made some decent money working alongside the Americans, were terrified of losing everything. They needed to sink their cash into solid real estate, and fast. Through some connections, they found this house. It was huge, way bigger than anything they thought they could afford. It was owned by a couple who were both doctors. These doctors, they saw the writing on the wall. They knew the foreign aid was drying up and the regime was going to change, so they were liquidating all their assets to flee the country. They sold the house to my grandparents for pennies on the dollar. It felt like a miracle. And the place was immaculate. I mean, it belonged to a pair of wealthy, educated doctors. My grandfather used to tell me that when they moved in, they didn't even have to sweep the floors. There wasn't a speck of dust. The wife had planted all these beautiful porcelain flowers in the courtyard. It was a dream home. But there was this one thing, just a minor annoyance really in the grand scheme of things. In the kitchen, right under the heavy concrete sink, there was a dampness. The plumbing just kept weeping water into the cabinet underneath. It wasn't a massive leak, just a constant, damn slow seep. Because of the humidity in Saigon, that enclosed space under the sink always smelled like mildew. You know that heavy, earthy stink of wet rot and old algae? It just clung to the back of your throat whenever you walked into the kitchen. My grandfather was a practical man. He brought in plumbers, handymen, masons. They patched the pipes. They slathered waterproof cement over the brickwork. They replaced the tiles. Nothing worked. After a few months, the dampness would just bleed right back through the concrete. Eventually, the plumbers just threw their hands up. They blamed it on a bad underground water vein or the primitive pipe materials of the era, and told my grandfather he'd just have to live with it. Just toss some fresh cement over it every few months to keep the rot down. So they just accepted it. A quirky flaw in an otherwise perfect house. A year later, in 1976, my mother was born. Now the post-war years were rough. Even with a nice house, money was incredibly tight, and food was scarce. My grandparents were working themselves to the bone just to keep food on the table, which meant my mom was left to her own devices a lot of the time. She was a quiet toddler. Too quiet. When she was about 2 or 3 years old, my grandmother started noticing things that didn't make sense. She'd be out in the front yard, washing clothes, leaving my mom playing alone in the living room. When she'd come back inside, she'd find my mom sitting on the kitchen floor, and scattered all around her on the tiles would be ceramic bowls, plates, and spoons. My mom would be playing with them, like a tea set. The thing is, those dishes were kept on a high wooden drying rack mounted to the wall. There was absolutely no physical way a 3-year-old could reach them. My grandmother just figured she must have carelessly left them on the counter, and maybe my mom dragged them down. Your brain does that, you know. It builds these flimsy little bridges of logic to cross over the terrifying gaps in reality. But then there was the speech issue. My mom was physically healthy. She ran around and played, but she wouldn't talk. By the time she was 3, she was only communicating in single, grunted syllables, just making basic sounds demanding food or movement. It was like something was actively suppressing her development. When she finally started stringing words together, around age 4, she started asking my grandparents a question that chilled them to the bone. She kept tugging on my grandmother's shirt, constantly asking about where her friends went. My grandmother would brush it off, reassuring her that her kindergarten friends would be there tomorrow. But my mom would shake her head, looking frustrated, insisting that she meant the dozens of friends right there in the house, the ones who played with her whenever the adults were working. She'd point a chubby little finger straight at the kitchen, claiming they were hiding right in there, under the sink. It's easy to dismiss a kid's imaginary friends. But when my mom pointed at those heavy wooden cabinet doors beneath the leaking concrete sink, the exact spot that constantly smelled of rot, my grandparents felt this cold, heavy rock drop into their stomachs. It wasn't until the early 80s, when my mom was about 7 and still obsessing over the space under the sink, that my grandparents finally had enough money to hire a spiritual master, a monk who specialized in cleansing properties. He didn't even need to walk through the whole house. He stepped through the front door, stopped, and stared directly toward the back kitchen. He told them the history of the house, and here is the most chilling part. My grandparents swear to this day that they never told this man a single thing about who owned the house before them. Hell, nobody knew, but the monk just stood there, staring dead at the kitchen tiles, and started talking about the couple. He said those doctors didn't just work at the hospital. They ran an illegal underground clinic out of this house. Specifically, they performed secret abortions. Back in the days when foreign soldiers were everywhere, a lot of local girls ended up in desperate, terrifying situations. They came to this beautiful, pristine house to make their problems go away, and the doctors, they had to dispose of the evidence quickly and quietly. The monk pointed to the sink. He said the doctors had been flushing the fetal remains down the heavy drainage pipe in the kitchen. Some of it didn't make it to the sewer. Some of it got caught in the ancient cast iron traps under the floorboards. The monk said the dampness, the rot, the smell. It wasn't just water. It was the concentrated grief and confusion of dozens of unborn souls, trapped in the dark, festering right beneath where my family washed their vegetables. I can't even begin to imagine how my grandmother felt hearing that sick crap, knowing her little girl had been sitting on the floor, playing tea party with them. The monk spent days chanting, burning heavy incense, and performing banishing rituals. He managed to clear out most of the energy, but on the last day, he looked exhausted. He told my grandparents that he'd moved about a dozen of the spirits on, but there were a few left, 3 or 4 of them, and they were stubborn. They didn't know anything else but the dark dampness under that sink, and they refused to leave. He said, "You can't force them out anymore. If you push too hard, they will lash out." The only option left was coexistence. He instructed my grandparents to clear out the cabinet under the sink and turn it into a tiny shrine. Nothing elaborate, just a small ceramic incense burner. He told them to light 1 single stick of incense every few days. Acknowledgement. That was the rent my family had to pay to live in their space. And it worked. The day the shrine was set up, my mom completely stopped talking about her friends. She never went near the kitchen cabinet again. Decades passed. The house was renovated. The plumbing was finally dug up and replaced, and the dampness disappeared. The secret of the shrine just faded into the background noise of family life. Which brings us to me. I was born in 1999. My dad had moved to the city from the provinces, married my mom, and moved into the big family house. I had a totally normal childhood, up until I was about 4 years old, around 2003. It was the new year, and someone, I don't even know who, had brought home one of those massive, glossy wall calendars. You know the ones? They're super common in Vietnamese households. Bright red background, gold lettering. This one featured a giant painting of the Laughing Buddha, surrounded by 5 or 6 chubby little toddlers in traditional red silk bibs. For some reason, my 4-year-old brain was absolutely obsessed with this calendar. Every time I walked past it in the hallway, I'd grab a marker or a pen, and I'd draw on the kids' faces. I'd give them mustaches, black out their teeth, scribble over their eyes. Just stupid, mindless kid stuff. I did this for an entire year, until the calendar was covered in my scribbles. When the year ended, normally you just throw the old calendar away. But older folks here, they are incredibly superstitious about throwing away images of deities. You don't just toss the Buddha in the trash with the leftover rice. So, my grandmother, trying to be respectful, took the thick cardboard backing of the calendar, carried it into the kitchen, and used it as a mat under the little incense burner in the sink cabinet. I noticed it was missing from the wall and got upset. I went hunting for my drawing board. One afternoon, while my mom was distracted, I opened the wooden doors under the sink, and there it was. I didn't care about the incense burner. I just pushed it aside, crawled my little body completely inside the dark cabinet, pulled the doors shut behind me, and sat in the suffocating smell of old ash, just happily scribbling on the faces of those painted children in the pitch black. I did this secretly for weeks. I'd sneak in, draw, put the burner back exactly how I found it, and crawl out. Nobody knew. Then the dreams started. At first, they weren't scary. I'd fall asleep and suddenly I was running around the house. And I wasn't alone. There were kids with me. 4 or 5 little kids, all wearing those traditional red silk bibs. The boys with their heads shaved except for a little tuft on top. The girls with twin buns. Exactly like the kids on the calendar. They were so happy. They'd grab my hands, pulling me through the hallways, giggling and begging me to come play with them. But the dreams always shifted. Right before I woke up, the atmosphere would just curdle. The air would get freezing cold. The kids would stop running. They'd turn to look at me, and their faces would contort into this absolute seething rage. They would violently scream at me, demanding to know why I had drawn on their faces and why I was ruining their house by sitting in their spot. Then they'd lunge at me. I'd wake up screaming, thrashing in my bed. My parents would flip on the lights, and my mom would gasp. There were long, angry red scratches down my cheeks and arms. Real, physical scratches. My parents panicked, but their brains did that logical gymnastics routine again. My dad desperately reasoned that it had to be rats, convincing himself that the old house was to blame and a rat must have crawled on the bed while I was sleeping to scratch me. They bought traps. They put cotton balls on my cuts. But the dreams kept happening. Every few nights. The giggling, the playing, and then the sudden, violent hatred, the scratching. One night, the dream got so violent I woke up hyperventilating. But I wasn't in my bed. I was lying on the cold kitchen tiles, right in front of the sink cabinet. I had sleepwalked. I started wailing in the dark until my parents found me. I was terrified of the kitchen. After that, I refused to go near it. About a month into this nightmare, my mom was doing the routine cleaning for the mid-month full moon. She was sweeping the house, wiping down the main family altar. She was home alone. My dad had taken me to the park. She was finishing up in the kitchen when she noticed the sink cabinet doors were slightly ajar. She opened them to clean the little shrine, and for the first time, she saw the calendar mat. She saw the heavy scribbles, the defaced Buddha, the blackened faces of the children. It was damp and rotting at the edges. She decided it was disrespectful to keep it there. She couldn't throw it in the trash, so she figured the most honorable way to dispose of it was to burn it, along with the paper offerings she was going to burn for the full moon anyway. She took it out to the front pavement. It was around 6 p.m., that weird, liminal twilight hour. The street was incredibly busy, motorbikes zooming past, horns blaring, the chaotic white noise of the city rush hour. She lit the pile of paper offerings and slid the thick cardboard calendar underneath. The flames flared up, hot and orange. She was crouching there, using a stick to poke the fire, when she heard a voice. It wasn't coming from the street. It was tiny, squeaky, like a mouse whimpering about the intense heat. My mom froze. She looked around. Just businessmen on scooters and tired commuters. She poked the fire again, only to be met with a chorus of tiny, overlapping shrieks, crying out in panic that they were burning and accusing her of setting them on fire. My mom looked down into the fire. The cardboard calendar was thick, so it was burning slowly, the edges curling and turning black. She stared at the painted faces of the children as the embers ate into them. And I swear to God, she told me later that her blood turned to ice because the painted faces weren't smiling anymore. Through the distortion of the heat and the curling paper, she saw their mouths open, their eyes squeezed shut. Their painted features were actively grimacing in agony. A chill shot up her spine. She didn't rationalize that terrifying bullshit. She just reacted. She grabbed her stick and furiously shoved the cardboard deep into the hottest part of the fire, forcing it to turn to ash as quickly as possible. She ran back inside, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't say a word to my dad when we got home. She just locked the doors and went through the motions of dinner, trying to convince herself she was just exhausted and seeing things in the smoke. That night, my parents laid down on a mattress on the floor in their bedroom. I was sleeping on a separate little mat near the wardrobe, about a meter away from them. Deep in the night, the dream took me again, but this time, there was no playing. The second I closed my eyes, the kids were there, but they were wrong. Their red bibs were charred black. Their skin was blistering and glowing with internal heat, like logs left in a dying fire. "Your mother burned us," they shrieked, their voices like grinding glass, screaming that my mother had burned their house down. They swarmed me, grabbing my arms, my hair, biting at my face. In the real world, my mom woke up. She heard me whimpering and thrashing on my mat. The room was pitch black, lit only by the faint orange glow of the streetlights filtering through the window grates. She squinted toward my mat. There were shapes moving on top of me. At first, she thought it was a pack of rats. But as her eyes adjusted, the primal, animal part of her brain completely short-circuited in pure fucking terror. They were humanoids, but they were tiny, maybe the size of a man's hand. 4 or 5 of them, squatting on my chest, my legs, my face. They were pitch black, but not like shadows. They were textured, like burnt meat, and they were frantically digging their tiny, sharp fingers into my skin. My mom didn't scream. When you hit that level of absolute paralyzing terror, your vocal cords just shut down. She threw herself across the room and started violently swiping at the things on my body. She said it didn't feel like hitting flesh. It felt like passing her hands through thick, greasy, freezing cold smoke. She swatted them away, grabbed me by the armpits, and bolted. She didn't wake my dad. She didn't grab the keys. She just threw the front bolts open, sprinted out of the house, and ran barefoot into the middle of the empty, midnight street, clutching me to her chest. She just kept sobbing into my hair, frantically asking if I was okay over and over again. My dad woke up to the front door banging in the wind. He ran outside and found us shivering on the concrete divider in the middle of the road. We didn't go back inside that night. We sat on a stone bench down the block until the sun came up. That morning, my grandmother finally confessed the whole history of the house to my mom. The abortions, the sink, the shrine. They brought the monk back. A different one this time. An older master. He listened to the whole story and just sighed. He explained that the spirits under the sink had never formed bodies before they were flushed away. They were just raw, chaotic energy. When my grandmother put that calendar down there, with those bright, detailed pictures of healthy children, the spirits latched onto it. That cardboard became their physical anchor, their avatar. And when I crawled in there and drew all over their faces, I was violating their bodies. But the worst part was the burning. When my mom burned the calendar, she didn't banish them. She just burned their avatars. She trapped them in a state of perpetual, agonizing heat. The monk told them in a completely flat voice that they couldn't get rid of them now, explaining that the 30 years of incense had made the house their home just as much as ours, and though we had enraged them, they were bound to the space. There was no grand cleansing, no magical yellow talismans or heavy chanting that just wiped the slate clean. The monk simply told my grandmother to buy a new incense burner, put it back under the sink, and never, ever forget to light a stick. He gave them one strict warning, forbidding them from ever offering the spirits food, fruit, or meat. He compared it to feeding a stray dog prime steak, warning that the day they only had scraps, the dog would tear their throats out. He instructed them to use only plain incense, just enough to keep the entities hungry and weak, but satisfied enough to stay quiet. My grandparents are in their 70s now. They still live there. My parents moved us out a few years later, when they saved up enough money. Not explicitly because of the haunting, but nobody argued when the moving truck arrived. Whenever I go back to visit my grandparents for the holidays, the house feels so normal. It's bright. There's a massive flat-screen TV in the living room. The air conditioning hums. But sometimes, when I go to the kitchen to get a glass of water, I'll drop some damn thing. A spoon or a bottle cap. It'll roll across the tiles and tap against the wooden cabinet under the sink. I'll bend down to pick it up, and I can smell it, just faintly, under the smell of the cleaning supplies and the garlic from dinner. The smell of old ash. The shrine is still there, behind those doors. My grandmother has not missed a single day of lighting that incense in 20 years. She knows that if she forgets, even for a day, whatever is sitting in the dark, nursing its burns, will finally decide it's time to collect on our debt.